talking today to Danny Day, who is the CEO of QCF Design, who are game designers in South Africa. Danny, how did you make the first game that you made, which was an educational game?
That emerged out of our community. I accidentally started a community in 2004, 2005 by posting on a forum saying, hey, let's see if we can make some games. And that turned into a really interesting series of competitions, and eventually we got sponsored for the competitions, and then one of the third place games attracted another sponsor that said, can we convince Nokia that we can make games on cell phones to teach mathematical concepts? At which point we said yes, had another competition, and produced some really interesting results. That first game was called Mastermind. It's available on our website, qcfdesign.com, and it took off really well. It was for grade 10 schoolgirls in Mpumalanga. It did, let me see if I can remember the numbers. Yeah, we had some ludicrous things, like people were telling us, the teachers were telling us at the time that it was too hard and that we had to tone down the difficulty level for the girls because they wouldn't understand it. And in 2 weeks, all the girls had finished up to genius level, which we put in as like a, well, you know, we'll try and make it even harder because we like challenging people. All the girls had finished up to genius level, and as soon as they found out we'd made the game, they came running up to us and said, make it harder, what's the next thing to do? When can we do the next stuff? So we kind of, I feel like games are a really good way to challenge people to try and achieve interesting things.
And what's the challenge of doing things that, in a sense, people have to do in order to learn, and having games and the fun of games? What's the challenge there?
Well, a lot of people think that edutainment is the right way to go, where you sort of have an educational concept and you have a spoonful of sugar that's the fun game part that you then sort of like, well, you'll do the boring, and now you get to the fun bit. That doesn't work because there's access to so many other games out there that just have the fun part, right? And I think that's how a lot of people feel disillusioned about school, because it's not really entertaining. And we learn at school that learning is not fun. That's the first thing we learn, and it's horrible. And I think that what we found so far is that if you are able to build a systemic understanding of a concept into a game, we call it guerrilla learning in our community. If you build a systemic understanding of something, it will emerge as something that people will just automatically understand, because the process of playing a game is the process of learning something. As you're playing a game, you're learning, you know, the next thing you need to do. You're automatically proving to yourself that you can accomplish it. And we talk about a failure-rich environment, and failure being non-fatal. So if you fail in a game, that's great. You're like, oh, this is a challenge, I'm going to try and do better than this. I'm going to try again, I'm going to try again, I'm going to try again. And I have no understanding of why in typical educational environments you can't do that. If you fail an exam, try again. And teachers always say, oh no, but then they'd get all the questions right. I'm like, isn't that the point?
Yes.
I sort of thought that was the reason that we did that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that started emerging is that people kept asking, well, how do games teach things? And I would always use the story of, well, if you have somebody who plays a FIFA game, you know, which is about the process of physically playing soccer, if somebody's always playing a FIFA game, they won't be able to tackle a Ryan Giggs or, you know, a Pele, or, you know, I mean, even Pele now, they probably wouldn't be able to tackle Pele now, right? Yeah. But if somebody is playing a championship manager game, which is about running a football team itself and taking it through a league and everything, they could easily have a conversation with Sir Alex Ferguson that would make sense.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that kind of systemic understanding is what games are great at teaching.
Yeah. And so your next game up was Desktop Dungeons.
No, not really. We did a whole bunch of advergames and everything else before that.
And describe what advergames are.
Advergames are games where typically an advertising agency or some sort of client comes to you and says, we'll give you X much money to build something, and usually it's not enough. We'll give you X much money to build something in time that's far too short, you know, like do something in 2 weeks. Okay. In order to advertise a product or something like that. So we've done things on cell phones where you know, you're advertising some sort of product or whatever for other people. Eventually we found out that was probably not a great way to run a company and still eat food. Generally because your budgets were just far too low, and building a game is a very, very time-consuming process.
It's like the early years of web design.
In a way, yeah. Well, I was around for this. You sort of just end up using up every single available piece of creative content that you have, and every single skill. I mean, games take up art, sound, there's music, there's everything. You know, there's coding, and the coding is really tricky because it's novel coding. You're not actually approaching algorithms that other people understand already. You're always doing things that are new. So everybody who thinks like, oh, well, this is one part of games, it's usually always 10%.
Yeah.
And then, so we have a thing where in the industry where people say that there's 90% of the work when you get the game working, and then there's the other 90% of the work where you polish it. So that sort of is a problem when you're working on limited budgets. So we wanted to move towards a revenue system where we had a game that people would be paying us for. And up until PayPal was functional in South Africa, we didn't have a way of actually capitalizing on that.
Yeah.
We didn't have a method of actually producing a game that could do that. One of the game prototypes on our forum, the game.dev forum that sort of the accidental thing that started, was called Desktop Dungeons by a good friend of mine. And we've worked with him in the past. After a while, Mark and I, the other member of QCF, just said, hey, do you want to turn this into something bigger? So we came on board after the game was literally about 2 or 3 weeks old and just carried on working on it, you know. And Rodain, the guy's game it is, he's phenomenal. He sort of just disappeared and 48 hours later returned with, oh, hey, I made this. And everybody was playing it. And Desktop Dungeons from there...
You have a kind of free beta version, don't you?
Yeah, the free beta on the version on the forum just we kept improving it, kept improving it, kept improving it, and after a while it escaped.
Yes.
And sort of it hit the wild, and there were all these magazine articles about it, and there was like...
So how many people have downloaded it?
Over 2 million people so far have downloaded the beta.
Yeah.
That's been around since early 2010.
Yeah.
And then we were nominated for the 2011 Independent Games Festival in 2 categories, Excellence in Design and the Seamus McNally Grand Prize.
Yeah.
Which was amazing because I'd always wanted to go to GDC. I'd never been to the US. And going to sort of the seminal game developers conference in the world was just kind of like a dream come true, especially being in the IGF. You know, I used to dream about IGF when I was first starting game development forums that sort of popped up.
And you went the international route because there is no game distribution to speak of here in...
Well, we didn't plan to. Like I said, the beta sort of escaped. People. The forum was 150 people chatting about making games here in South Africa. How do we do this? What can we do? And here, play this prototype. Here, play this prototype. And a few games that Rodain and some of us had made before had started picking up some press and some indie game specific websites. But Desktop Dungeons sort of just exploded. Yeah. And we suddenly had hordes and hordes and hordes of people playing it. Yeah. And we were like, oh, okay, well, we've got to see what else we can do. So we tried to make the game as good as we could. Yeah. And then eventually we said, okay, so here's the design for the full game. Yeah. We started pitching that. We started working on that in another system. So we rebuilt the game from scratch and started offering pre-orders. Yeah. We were actually, pre-orders saved us from bankruptcy in a way. Yeah.
So you've had how many pre-orders?
Pre-orders were approaching about 10,000.
Okay. And when will the launch be?
Launch is, that's a tricky question. It's actually when it's done. The nice thing is that the game's already profitable. Yeah. So we are at a point where we can afford to really polish the game well, and we don't have to rush something out in order to try and meet the demands of either a market or a client or whatever it is, which is a novel position for us. I always tend to say, well, I think we've got about 2 months' work, but I think I started saying that about 6 months ago. Yeah. So. Right now we're working with one of the best games music composers in the world, Danny Baranovsky. He's doing sound. He's doing music for us. One of the best sound, indie game sound guys in the world. All people that we met while we were overseas. Yeah. So we're literally we went from being an exclusively South African team to just spreading all over the world. And at the same time, we've now got regular meetups here in Cape Town for local game development community things that we're doing. It's actually in 2 days' time, and we just push, trying to get as much of this information available out there, as much of the information as we've learned about building this game out there to other people as possible, so they can do the same thing. Yeah. Ideally,
And lastly, how big is the community of people who are playing games in South Africa?
I know. Well, okay, I can't give out numbers from friends of mine, unfortunately, on the web. But I know that we're hitting, I think, something like 120,000 dedicated PC/console players, and I know that a lot more than that play on mobile phones. Okay. Mobile phone stuff, like 2-3 years ago, we were talking about 30% of the population was accessing the internet on mobile phones, and you had a significant fraction of that accessing games regularly. The problem is that those games aren't going to be made by anybody local. And even if they were made by people local, or you attempt to be making a mobile game in an African context, for instance, none of the distribution mechanisms in South Africa, or in Kenya, or in Uganda, or in Nigeria allow for local content. beyond the ringtone slash, very, very
Yeah.
simple to deliver stuff. Because all the games and all that content comes from like international aggregators
Yes.
that bundle together huge amounts of content. And even the people internationally that are working in those markets don't make a lot of money. So it's not very sustainable
They're
as a business.
secondary or tertiary markets, aren't
Exactly.
they? They're kind of the lunch money after you've had the real money.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the problems. So we found that we can't really aim at a local market. You have to actually try and compete internationally, and then you end up locally again. So we've had people who come in, oh, we didn't know Desktop Dungeons was made by South Africans. It's actually good. There's a funny expectation of something that's made here on the continent as being second rate or not up to scratch.
Danny, thanks for talking to me today.